Does that sound fair? This is sales for nice people. There is a psychological trait, fairness, which is probably the most pervasive psychological bias that humans have. And it's not only humans. Primates, birds, rats. If you test them in a laboratory setting and you treat them unfairly, they will automatically, instinctively rail against it because nobody likes being treated unfairly. And obviously, you being a nice person, you're never going to treat your buyer unfairly. But salespeople, and therefore also sellers, even if you're not a professional salesperson, have a bad reputation. Because the simple fact is that a lot of the salespeople out there and a lot of businesses and a lot of sellers aren't all that ethical, aren't all that fair, and don't always do right by their buyers. And that means that you, as a good person, as an ethical, high-integrity entrepreneur, have a disadvantage that you need to overcome. Because the instinctive reaction that people have against people who try to sell something is, I'm not sure if I'm being taken advantage of, I'm not sure if all of this is the truth, I'm going to play it safe, I'm going to guard my cards, and I'm going to wait and see what's happening and whether or not I trust this person. That means that you have a disadvantage to overcome, simply because there are so many assholes out there, frankly, who try to take advantage of their buyers. But in order to overcome that bias and that skepticism that a lot of buyers have, you need to figure out how to win their trust. And one of the best ways to do that is to ask your buyer, does that sound fair? Because that way you are framing the conversation and the part of the conversation that you're in the context of fairness. And you're letting your buyer assess and decide whether or not they feel that you are being fair, which is much more effective than trying to convince a buyer that you're being truthful or honest or integrous. No, let your buyer judge for themselves whether they consider your dealings fair. So for instance, when you show up to a buyer conversation and you have a whole bunch of things that you need to figure out, you tell your buyer, listen, before I can make you a proposal, before I can give you any quote, I'm going to have to ask you a couple of questions in order to get a good read of the situation, and then we'll proceed and discuss whether or not we should work together and what it would look like. Does that sound fair? And your buyer is going to go, yeah, that sounds fair. Go ahead, ask your questions. Or maybe you've gone through the initial diagnosis and you figured out that, yeah, this is actually a really heavy lift and it's going to cost a lot of money. Well, then you can tell your buyer, look, what we've discussed so far looks like a pretty significant job. This is going to be a heavy lift and the cost is going to be quite high. I can solve the problem for you, but it won't be cheap. Does that sound fair? Your buyer will then either say, yes, that sounds fair, let's continue talking. Or, very importantly, they're going to surface objections, or as we like to call it in Sales for Nice People, buy blockers, that you can then address and work around. So they might say, yeah, well, we do need the problem solved, but we don't have a hell of a lot of budget. So maybe you can make adjustments to your payment terms, or you can adjust the scope of work and work on the most important parts of the project first. In both cases, no matter how your buyer replies, you establish a better connection and a better relationship with your buyer simply by asking, does this sound fair? And very importantly, you will let your buyer decide whether or not you are being fair, so you won't have to try and prove anything. That is Sales for Nice People. Go to salesfornicepeople.com/sign up if you want a short and helpful daily email, and I will see you again tomorrow.